This is an in-depth analysis of the knowledge gap, its applications, and potential specific applications of this theory that relate to agricultural communications. First, we're going to look at the history of the theory. The seminal theory was proposed in 1970 by a group of researchers from the University of Minnesota. Philip J. Tickner, George A. Donahue, and Clarice N. Olian composed the team that created the theory. The premise of the knowledge gap theory is that an increase in information does not increase knowledge in every member of society. Individuals that receive a college education have greater knowledge than those that only have a high school diploma. As more knowledge is provided to both groups via news, media, and the internet, the gap between these two groups increases. In other words, efforts to increase public awareness about issues may well increase overall levels of knowledge, but they may also increase the level of information inequality that is already present. This theory is composed of 5 proofs. First, people of higher socioeconomic status, or SES, are better communicators, have increased education, reading skills, comprehension, and recall than people of a lower SES. People of a higher SES store information more easily or can apply previous knowledge to an existing situation. People from a higher SES might have a more relevant social context, meaning that they have had experiences that they can relate to certain situations. An increased SES makes individuals more selective of information that they are exposed to, believe, and retain. And finally, mass media is geared towards people of a higher socioeconomic status. This example shows that education level or socioeconomic status made a difference in knowledge. The question was whether or not respondents felt astronauts would ever reach the moon. Those with high levels of education, based on 3 levels, grade school, high school, and college, were more likely to agree that man would reach the moon than those with lower levels of education, both at a certain point in time and over all 4 intervals. Most important was that the gap between levels widened over time, and that the percentage of respondents in the high education level who agreed rose more than 60 percentage points over 16 years, while those in the low level of education category rose less than 25 percentage points. There have been some theory updates since the seminal theory was proposed. In 1975, Tickner, Donahue, and Olian revisited the knowledge gap theory. They looked at the knowledge gap as related to local issues and found that over time there was a decrease in the gap that has been established based on socioeconomic status. One thought on this is that the level of interest is far greater when dealing with a local issue, no matter the education or SES of a person. Publicity of a local issue on a widespread scale tends to pique the interest of individuals because it is an issue of national importance. Another study looked into the knowledge gap based on the complexity of the study. Findings prove that the knowledge gap increased when addressing a new, more complex issue. An older issue that was less complex showed a constant relationship over time. There are many disciplines that have utilized the knowledge gap theory since 1970. Politics, education, communications, international and minority studies, and agriculture are just a few areas that have utilized this theory. First, let's look at an example from a political standpoint. Thomas M. Holbrook applied the knowledge gap theory to the United States presidential campaigns from 1976 to 1996. Presidential campaigns were selected for the study because the goal of a campaign is to increase knowledge among voters that will change the course of the election in the favor of a particular party. Holbrook utilized studies that had been conducted in regard to separate parts of a presidential campaign. In 1983, Mayo published a study that he had completed on the effects of a campaign using Wisconsin voters. There was an education-based gap that appeared, and this gap remained constant for 2 presidential elections. Another key study was Limmert's study of the knowledge gap after a presidential debate. The goal was to learn if a presidential debate helped voters to identify the key issues of the campaign. He found that in gaps associated with gender, education, and interest, the gap widened after the debate. This supports the premise of the knowledge gap theory because there was an overall increase in knowledge and a direct widening. A comparison was compiled between presidential campaigns and typical mass media campaigns. There were three key differences that separated these two groups. First, presidential campaigns have a variety of sources to communicate information to the public. Paid advertising on the radio, in print, and on television, daily news coverage of the issue, and special coverage of events like presidential debates or conventions all set these campaigns apart. Of course, it wouldn't be a presidential campaign if there wasn't a certain amount of conflict. This helps pique the interest of a wider demographic because conflict is interesting to a variety of viewers. Finally, media coverage lasts for months. From primary election campaigns to the actual presidential campaign, we have information overload in the media. Commercials become almost constant as the first Tuesday in November approaches. Media coverage of polls, radio ads, and the last-minute campaign efforts make it almost impossible to not know what is going on with the presidential election. Open-ended questions were utilized in gathering data for this particular article. Voters were asked if there were any positive qualities about a particular candidate. If they answered yes, then the voter was asked to list up to 5 reasons. Each reason that the voter gave was worth 1 point. So the range of points available to the survey were 0 to 20 points. This particular format helps alleviate bias of the researcher because voters can take a question in a number of different directions. 2 key factors that were evaluated was the amount of voter education and the knowledge gap. The second was a measure of the knowledge gap as more information became available to voters. For the educational evaluation, voters were divided into groups based on levels of education, and the gap was analyzed within each level. The results indicated that people in the high-level group could identify nearly twice as many reasons as the low education group. The next step was to assess how the knowledge gap progressed throughout the presidential election. It is clear that the goal of any presidential campaign is to inform the people to ensure that they make an enlightened decision at the voter box. The problem is that there are external influences that prevent the information from being effectively communicated to certain demographics of voters. The knowledge gap was proven to grow in 4 of the 6 presidential campaigns that were analyzed. This being said, presidential debates aided in decreasing the knowledge gap. With the high-profile coverage related to presidential campaigns, there are more voters that can gain a vast amount of knowledge during these debates. This information, while available before, but it wasn't available in formats that low education voters got the opportunity to be exposed to, so that the low education voters are now able to catch up with the high education voters. It helps to level the playing field, so to speak, and decreases the knowledge gap among education groups. Now we're going to look at an example related to agriculture. In 1995, an article was published in the Journal of Agricultural Education titled Rural and Urban Adult Knowledge and Perceptions of Agriculture. This article was authored by Martin J. Frick of Montana State University, Robert J. Birkenholtz of the University of Missouri, go Mizzou, and Christiana McTimes of Purdue University. The purpose of this study was to quantitate the agricultural literacy level of 2 different groups, urban and rural. There were 3 specific objectives at the core of this study: to assess the level of agricultural knowledge among rural and urban adults in a Midwestern state. The second was to assess the level of agricultural perceptions among rural and urban adults in a Midwestern state. And finally, it was to describe the demographic variables of both subgroups that may influence their knowledge of perceptions of agriculture. The third objective is what makes this study relevant to knowledge gap theory. Assessing education of the study participants and drawing conclusion makes this applicable to the knowledge gap theory. The methodology that was utilized was to ask the study group questions concerning 7 different topics in agriculture that I have here on the slide. The participants were given questionnaires and responded true, false, or don't know. The same 7 categories were then utilized to present the respondents with statements. The respondent could mark strongly agree to neutral to disagree. There were an even number of questions and statements asked from each of the 7 categories. There were several demographic parameters applied to this study. The goal of the demographic information was to determine whether knowledge widened as there was an increase in exposure to agriculture. The data was analyzed using a stepwise regression. There were 5 conclusions formed from the research. Rural and urban groups were both most knowledgeable about animals concept and the least about plants and agriculture. Urban respondents were 1.1% more knowledgeable than the rural group. When perceptions were analyzed, natural resources received the most positive feedback, while ag policy was the least positive. Growing up on a farm increased your agricultural literacy. Importantly, the respondents with higher levels of education were more knowledgeable about agriculture than those with less education. Both groups were somewhat knowledgeable about agriculture. The fact that respondents with higher levels of education were more knowledgeable about agriculture is information that directly relates to the knowledge gap theory. In the future, this article recommends instructional programs in elementary and secondary schools that will enhance knowledge levels of all citizens. It will be important to utilize our understanding of the knowledge gap theory in order to effectively communicate when we are creating these instructional programs. Rural and urban adult knowledge and perceptions of agriculture is a great example of an article that questions the barrier to communicating about the agricultural industry as related to demographics, specifically education level. While the article does not define its findings as specifically related to the knowledge gap theory, the utilization of demographic information to formulate a recommendation is key. One change would be to address the socioeconomic status of adults to include in the information. This could describe whether the highly educated about agriculture are in an upper class or an impoverished class. It would help to validate the theory. Another important addition would be to measure the knowledge as there is more information about agriculture provided. The knowledge gap theory contends that the knowledge gap increases as more information is provided. Therefore, it would be vital to measure the change in knowledge gap over time. Utilizing a variety of communication techniques and campaigns can help identify areas that decrease the knowledge gap among certain demographics, which would be beneficial for future agricultural communicators. The knowledge gap could help to understand the barriers to communication that we are facing with certain demographics. It is important to understand not only what demographics understand the least about agriculture, but effective ways to bring them the information. For example, if the majority people with the least amount of knowledge about agriculture are intimidated by newspaper articles, then reaching out to them with a newspaper campaign is foolish. This does not mean that newspaper articles are not valid venues of information, but that rather than increasing the knowledge in this demographic, we would further confuse them into less understanding than they had before they were educated. Utilizing knowledge gap theory with research like the agricultural literacy article that I detailed earlier would help to understand how to reach a wider demographic. Agriculture is coming into times where it matters that everyone know where their food is coming from. Understanding barriers to communication, which is essentially what the knowledge gap provides, will help us to formulate effective communication approaches to a wide variety of individuals.